In September 2024, I walked the Cape Wrath Trail in Scotland. This 330km trail starts from Fort William and goes north up through the Western Highlands to Cape Wrath, the most northwesterly point on the UK mainland. It goes through a real variety of stunning landscapes, from deep wooded valleys to open mountainsides. There's plenty of wildlife to spot, herds of deer, seals, flocks of migrating geese and butterflies. I always find the people in Scotland to be friendly and welcoming, and you can end up meeting some real characters if you stay in a bothy. This is also considered to be one of the UK's most challenging long distance walks. It's remote, unmarked, and sections of it are completely pathless. The terrain is frequently rough and boggy, there are river crossings, midges, and the changeable Scottish weather to contend with. Walking this trail was a real adventure, and in this video I'm going to tell you all about it. I travelled by sleeper train to Fort William, which is the southern terminus of the trail. The train arrived into Fort William at about 10 in the morning. It was a really nice sunny day. I had a couple of hours until the next ferry crossing, so I took it easy. Stocked up on some additional food bits at the supermarket, got some smidge insect repellent, and then went and had a leisurely breakfast, charged my phone, etc. while I waited for this next ferry. And before long, I headed over to the Kinlochewe ferry. There was a guy there from Belgium who just walked the Kinlochewe and was heading over to Ardgour for a few days camping. Before long, the ferryman arrived and a few of us got on. The ferry's pretty short, as you can see. It takes only about 10 minutes to go over. What you do get is a great view of Ben Nevis towering over Fort William as you head over. Before long, I was stepping off the ferry and taking my first steps on the Cape Wrath Trail, which are not particularly exciting. So the first, I would say, 15 kilometres, you're just walking down this A road, which is classified as an A road, but there's hardly any traffic on it. There's a car every 10 minutes or so. It was quite a hot day, so I was glad that this path actually goes through quite a lot of shaded woodland. Anyway, eventually you come down to Inverskadal Bay, where you leave the road and the path goes up into Cona Glen. There's a potential kind of alternate start to this as well. So what you could do if you don't want to do quite as much road walking is, I think you can get a bus down to Corran here and get the Corran ferry over, and then you've only got 5 kilometres of road walking up to this sort of turn off, as opposed to the 15 which you take from the ferry. Entering Cona Glen, we're on quite a nice track that winds its way up the valley. It was increasingly hot in the afternoon, and soon I left the shade of all these kind of woodland bits in the lower valley, and that combined with a heavy pack with all my kind of food for the first week or so made it tougher going than I anticipated. I think I stopped for some rest in a little bit of shaded woodland around here. As you continue up into the kind of higher bits of the glen, it becomes increasingly kind of wild. The bottom bit was way more kind of farmland, and this felt more kind of moor. There were also quite a lot of biting flies enjoying the sun, which was not the best. The sun was starting to head towards the mountains by the time I passed this little hillock in the middle of the valley, so I started looking for somewhere to camp. There's actually not a ton of great places here. What I did find is a tiny little spot here by the river which looks idyllic but soon became complete midge hell and was a total novice error. I had to put the full midge head net on while I cooked dinner and then walk up and down the track to lose the midges while I ate. Got into my tent, did some reading, and then went to bed. I woke up with the dawn, which is just before 7 at this time of the year. Packed up quickly to escape the morning midges. So, short walk on this track, a little bit further up, and then you start climbing up to the first pass of many. Really good view over this corrie to the west. And then coming over into the pass itself, there was some cloud on the northern side. This descent here was pretty misty for most of it. As I came around here, I dropped out the bottom of it and got some nice views of the mountains ahead. Joined up with a track leading down the valley to Callop, and soon was at this road. So there's a footbridge over the River Callop at Glen, and you should be able to follow this track and cross over it. Unfortunately, it's been damaged by floodwater and has been closed. It was closed when I came through here on a cycle tour in 2021, and it is still closed for repairs 3 years later. So what I had to do was walk along this A road here, which was pretty busy, but the verge was large enough that I felt safe. So it wasn't the most fun, but it was also fine. And I came into Glen, where there's a visitor centre and a cafe. I stopped for a coffee and a little break. Pretty busy with tourists coming to the viaduct, which is famous from the Harry Potter films. But as soon as you're past the viaduct, there's pretty much no one else on this track leading up to Glen. I crossed over this bridge and came to Bhudie. It was still kind of sunny, so I sat outside on a bench and ate some lunch. A passing runner told me about a little pool in the river, slightly further up, which would be good for a swim. I went and found it and washed the previous day's sweat off me. And then continuing on, the path climbs up this valley gently at first. Once you turn off to the east, this gets pretty steep. The kind of upper reach of it were pretty rough. There wasn't really any path. It was quite scrambly, and at some points you were kind of walking up a little bit of a stream. It levels out pretty quick at the top though, and I got glimpses of the valley beyond. There's a waterfall on the northern side of the pass going down. This bit of track is mega steep. Definitely one to be careful. This valley I found generally pretty wet and boggy underfoot, which is a kind of sign of things to come really. There are a couple of other hikers as well who I think were heading to Invery or heading back. The path here isn't the most distinct, so instead of following this kind of line of the map, what I actually ended up doing was missing that kind of turning over and being stuck on this side of the river, which was pretty wet along this little section by the fence, but it was kind of okay once I came out here and then rejoined the kind of track and crossed over the river and then went through this forest onto the track. This like little section linking up to the like forest track is really like pretty rough, but it's so short that it's kind of fine. And then you're kind of on a forestry track for quite a while going up into Glen Dessary. And one thing to note about OS maps is that for forests, they are noting the land use type, not its state. So a lot of this had actually been felled, so it was open and you could get views out over the kind of northern bit of the valley, although this bit here was much more foresty. Anyway, it was pretty easy walking, and eventually I came out this other side here by Bhudie. I decided I wasn't going to stay in the Bhudie because it was going to be a nice night. The views out over the valley, just as you exit this forest, were really good. Coming over into this bit of woodland here, I met a couple of people who'd been climbing Munros who were asking about the state of the track heading back down the valley. They said that the tracks further onwards going the way that I was going were like really awful. I think one guy said like the worst he's ever seen. I kept going until these fords here. There's like narrow channels in the rocks where these two rivers meet, and a really kind of sketchy wooden bridge over this like ravine with all the water going through. I found a little flattish spot in the woods here where I set up camp for the night. There weren't so many midges, which was a relief. I realised that I dropped my insect repellent I picked up in Fort William, which was a big mistake. So given the people that I'd met the day before were saying that the paths through the woods were awful, I took this path on the kind of higher sides of the valley. It was quite wet in places, but generally it was okay, and you got some nice kind of views out over the valley. Where it met up with this track coming here, I could see why they thought it was so awful, because it was a kind of all-terrain vehicle track which had been chewed up. This path sort of like paralleled the kind of main ATV track as a kind of like walking path. Anyway, you turn off from this ATV track here. I started going over this pass here, past these lochans, a little bit indistinct until you reach the lochans, but by them the path picks up to be much nicer and clearer. Along here I met a father and son from the Netherlands who are hiking to Invery. I stopped and chatted to for a little bit. Soon you start heading down on the Knockdamph river and you round a kind of corner here and you can see out to Loch Nid and down to Sawleys. Shortly after, when I reached Sawleys, I went inside to check it out. I opened the door and there was a guy in his underwear leaning over looking at himself. I immediately knew what he was doing, so I said hi and asked if he wanted help checking for ticks. He laughed and said yes, and so I had a little tick inspect for him. He then repeated the courtesy for me. I had a nice little chat to him. He was from Birmingham and here visiting botties and doing walking. He'd come over from Barisdale, which is where I was planning to head later that day. Had some intel on the path ahead, said it was super rough and challenging, but then it also gave me a really helpful tip for avoiding a notoriously boggy section ahead. Had a bit more of a chat and then headed off. So the tide was mostly in, and I couldn't walk all the way around on the beach, which was a bit of a shame. But I could walk far enough, avoid the kind of notoriously tricky path that goes up over here that you take when the tide is all the way in. And so there was just a little kind of scrambly climb over the last bit of headland and down onto this beach here where I stopped and had a little bit of quick lunch. Instead of following the main path that goes over up to this footbridge past Cona and then follows the river, the valley this way, what I did was I kind of skirted the base of the hills here, and it was quite wet underfoot, but it wasn't like really mega kind of bog, which I've heard this path is. There was a nice little kind of shortcut, come and reach an estate track here, which is also I think in better condition than the path on the other side of the river, which is much more just kind of footpath. Anyway, the estate track kind of winds its way up to here, it kind of peters out and disappears. So you have to cross the river, which is fine, it's pretty shallow, and then you're kind of back on the notional Cape Roth Trail path. Anyway, we're now deep in Knockdamph, which is one of the most rough and remote areas of the UK. The path is pretty gentle to begin with as it climbs up into this valley. It gets steeper and steeper. Eventually this river becomes a kind of series of ravines. At one point here, path goes through some woodland and it's seriously rocky. You're almost sort of climbing at points over like rocks and things. You have to be really kind of like careful, and it's kind of tricky to see where you're going. I think there's a higher path which is a little bit easier, but I missed it for whatever reason. Really beautiful there. You come out by this ruin and then you head further up into this kind of higher bit of the valley. A tough old climb, especially since it started raining, then levels out quite a lot here, bringing you in this kind of remote high little bit. Pretty atmospheric in the misty rain, especially with a kind of herd of deer watching you from a bit further up. Following the river, there's a kind of pathless section until you come to this kind of turning point of the river. Then what you have to do is climb up to meet this track here, and there's no really defined path meeting them. You just had to pick a direction going up the side of this hill and climb up it, and it was really quite difficult. But eventually you reach this footpath and you keep climbing up. Really beautiful views back along the valley and of the mountains shrouded in the mists. The guidebook I had describes this landscape as Tolkien-esque, and here I really felt that was the case. Further up into the misty clouds until I reached the kind of top of the pass, which I think is, I don't know, somewhere around there. Then you start heading down and it's pretty steep to begin with, levels out pretty quickly. It wasn't far till Barisdale at the end of the day, so once I'd gotten past this steep bit and was alongside the river, I kind of sped down the valley, and rounding this corner you can start to see out towards the sea, onto some estate tracks, and soon you arrive at Barisdale. So this is a bothy and a campsite which is owned by the Barisdale estate. When I say a campsite, it's a flattish section of grass next to the bothy. There was forecast to be a pretty intense storm that evening, so I decided to stay in the bothy. It has a toilet and electricity, practically like staying in a hotel. There were a couple of young guys there who I joined in the kitchen room. The two walkers from the Netherlands I'd met came in. We all ate dinner together and had a good old chat. Later on, a big group of walkers from Inverie came in and sheltered in the bothy for a little bit while they set up their tents. Glad I wasn't outside because it was raining pretty hard and it was pretty windy. I woke up to the ends of the storm, had breakfast and chat to the others and some of the group from last night. They were doing a nature immersion course. I'd hiked over from Inverie and was staying in the vicinity of the bothy for a few days. Then I set off towards Kinlochewe. So you go on the estate track for a little bit to begin with, turn off along this lochside path here. It's pretty okay to begin with, but got rougher and rougher as it went along. The heavy rain last night meant that pretty much all the footpaths had become streams, so another day of wet feet. Path looks pretty chilled on a map, but is actually really kind of like quite up and down. There were also these intense kind of rain squalls that were coming in once I was heading past Runeval. Once I got past Skeary, there were these kind of wooded rhododendron bits by the loch, and then onto a lochside path by the shore, just covered in slippery seaweed in places. Eventually you come to an actual road somewhere around here. This whole section from Barisdale took way longer than you'd expect. I think it was like 2.5, 3 hours for me to walk it. At Kinlochewe there's a little tea room. I stopped for some coffee and cake. The rain kept coming off and on while I was there. I think the rest of the day was forecast to be like that. So leaving Kinlochewe, double back on yourself and head up a really steep climb to meet these power lines. You're on a good 4x4 track. You go over this pass here. You can see both ahead into the valley beyond with these looming rain clouds. You can also see back the kind of way that I'd came up this loch as well, which was nice. I took this path here which heads up into the mountains, and just before this river crossing here there's a little kind of stalker's shelter which I sat in and had lunch. Good timing because there was a heavy rain shower which blew through while I was there. Kept on this path here, and what the guidebook says to divert from the track and climb up the eastern side of the quarry. I did this, and to be honest it was pretty good going despite being kind of a cross country. It wasn't too rocky, it wasn't too boggy. I met up with the river again, crossed over. This last section though, climbing up onto the pass, was a pretty tough old climb, pathless and really rocky at the top. But eventually I came out at the top of the Bialach. Was rewarded with a moody view. This is a kind of short saddle pass between these two ridges. Had a short rest and then set off heading down. The route follows this kind of old stone wall under the underside of Forcan Ridge here. The guidebook says that it's a kind of wall, but it's more like the kind of end of a rough scree scope, at least to begin with. Gets a little bit easier as you head north, and then you're descending on a kind of rough path. Short, sharp showers hit here, and I got buffeted by the winds and the rain and felt pretty exposed. It comes down to here. You've got a choice of how to descend, east or west. I took this kind of west pathless descent down to the valley. It was really boggy and slippy for the first bit, levels out once you get to the river. Still pretty boggy and wet though. At the bottom of the valley where it meets this other valley, cross over the river. I was a little bit worried that with all the rain crossing, the river would be like really tough to cross because of the rain. It would be kind of be in spate, but it was completely fine. And then a few kilometres on this nice easy track and you come into Shiel Bridge. Here I stayed at a campsite which is there, and it's set up for walkers. It's a good friendly place. I had a nice set of showers. Pitches were perhaps a little rocky, but otherwise good and flat. I had a campus shelter, which is a kind of covered structure with some picnic benches in where you could cook dinner. I set up my tent in between the rain showers, made myself a bit of dinner. I had a shower where I washed all the mud out of my socks, then went to bed. I woke up to more on and off rain, had a bit of breakfast, packed up. The first part of the day follows the A road over to Morvick. Pretty busy, but you're not on it for a huge amount of time, so it's kind of okay. Morvick, there's a little shop called Kintel Crafts, which is a kind of Cape Wrath Trail institution, Aladdin's cave type of shop with everything. I wanted to pick up some extra supplies here, but it wasn't open until a little bit later. So I went into a little cafe next door and had a coffee and egg roll. And then by this time Kintel Crafts is opened. I went in and picked up some supplies, the most important of which was some more insect repellent to replace the smidge that I'd lost. And then onwards through the kind of light rain. Near the actual activity centre here, I caught up with another walker who was also walking the Cape Wrath Trail. Bit of a chat and then separated so we could walk by ourselves. This path climbs up through some forestry tracks, then diverts up this valley here. This was pretty steep, but also quite beautiful in its own way, especially because there were little patches of sun that were coming through. Coming up out of the valley onto the top here, I could see snow on some of the peaks to the north, which was a bit of a surprise. I think there'd been a kind of cold snap. Descended down to the falls of Glen, which are the UK's largest waterfall, and you could hear them roaring in the distance as I approached. Pretty impressive. The guidebook says to avoid the descent path next to them in bad weather. And I think if I could go back again, I would have taken an alternate which avoids the falls, because coming down was very sketchy. First, I missed the path coming down and took the path down to the viewpoint, which was really slippy and really exposed. I had to climb back up, eventually found the actual path going down, which was okay to begin with, but soon there were sections of exposed rock which you had to kind of scramble down with an exposed drop over. These sections weren't too long, but after they would just be kind of these these slippy steep bits. Then this little tributary here was kind of in like full spate, so I couldn't cross it down where it met the river coming for the falls. I had to find a little section further up where I could cross it safely and then kind of detour down. And the path after this kind of hugged the rest of the valley and was steep, and then more kind of rocky scrambles, etc. Flattened out, and you come to some footbridges here. There was a break in the rain, and I took the opportunity to eat some lunch in the sun by the river. This track here, which goes towards Iron Lodge, I started to notice a bit of a twinge in my right ankle. Did a little bit of stretching, got my walking poles out and slowed my pace down a little bit, all of which seemed to help. It's been raining on and off, and my waterproof jacket had gotten pretty soaked through, so I was starting to get quite cold. Somewhere around here I got my puffery jacket on, along with my warm hat, seemed to be a big help. This estate track leading up to Iron Lodge is in pretty good condition, but sort of past Iron Lodge it becomes way rougher. Clouds closed down and it started to rain a little bit more. Really moody Scottish vibes. Another river crossing here at this ford, and then a pretty steep section up to the top of this pass here. And I was thinking of finding somewhere to camp around here, so I could see there were some ruins marked on my map, but there was nowhere kind of flat or which looked good. So I decided to keep on going onwards towards the bothy at Maol Bhudie. This valley which I came down into was really beautiful. It had a kind of remote tundra-like feel to it. The path kind of crosses this river almost sort of constantly, and everything was like totally soaked underfoot. As I headed closer towards the bothy, I could like see these things in the sky, and I realised there were these huge flocks of migrating geese. As they passed closer, you could hear their kind of honking calls if you listened carefully. I saw a couple of them as I went towards the bothy, and they were like absolutely stunning, forming these amazing shifting, mesmerising formations. Eventually came to Maol Bhudie bothy. You've got to cross through the river to actually get to it, but then you're inside and out of the cold and the wet. Bothy itself is really nice. It looked like it'd been redone inside recently. There's 3 separate rooms to it. As I was unpacking my stuff, the woman that I'd met earlier came in. We're both really thankful for the bothy as the wind had got up and the rain kept on hammering down. Made myself some dinner, spread my wet stuff out to dry as best I could. And although it was dry inside the bothy, it was a cold night. I could see my breath on the air as I headed off to sleep. So when I woke up in the morning, my right ankle was really stiff, and a set of movements would send kind of jarring pain down it. I was in quite a remote area, and really the only option was to continue walking. The other walker left before me in the morning, and I think I set off shortly after 8. The first section of the day is a kind of pathless, boggy section. First there's a kind of river crossing at the outflow of the loch, which, although it was swollen from the rain, water came up to sort of midway up my thighs. It wasn't impassable by any means. Boggy ground after this, wet underfoot, and a couple of peat hags which took a while to navigate. I could see snow and frost on the top of some of the hills surrounding. Came by this second loch here and crossed over onto a straight track, which was pretty okay, and ran alongside this loch and quite wet in sections. Met a couple of Munro baggers somewhere around here, as I headed up over pass here, which was like super gentle. My ankle wasn't so good on the descent bit and the kind of rougher sections of the path. I was pretty much using my walking poles as crutches here. What I could see is the small estate bothy at Benadryl Lodge. It's a really nice little bothy, has a sofa in. Ate my lunch inside and rested my leg. So a little bit more walking on the estate track, and then you turn off the estate track sort of where this fence line is here. And there's a pathless section which you kind of follow the posts of the fence line up this billet, which was slow going, but the sun was out now and the weather was good, so it was quite nice. At the top you go past these little lochans, you get these views out west onto the Achnashallach forest area. You also pick up a little footpath here which was quite rough and also really quite wet, but at least it's something. As you turn northwards you get these really great views of the Westeros mountains. By this point the path was really nice, but the descent was really not good for my ankle. What should have taken me until the early afternoon ends up with me arriving at Strathcarron at about 6 o'clock. At Strathcarron I went to the hotel, which has pictures for camping. The owner, Richard, was a really nice guy. I'd mailed myself a resupply parcel to collect here. I set up my tent and then went into the bar to have some dinner. I think I had some fish soup and then fish and chips and a pint. Feeling full and sleepy, I went to bed pretty early. Woke up early to the sound of the 7 a.m. train that goes to Inverness. My ankle was really stiff and not feeling really good. But being quite a stubborn guy, I thought I would at least try, keep on going and to see if it would get any better. So after packing up, I went on this winding path alongside the River Carron. A bit insecty at times when I stopped, but I did get to see some stags for the first time, which was cool. Eventually I reached this A road here and then walked along it to Coolags, where I hitched a lift. This lovely older couple who lived on Skye and were on their way to a rewilding conference gave me a lift up the road to Achnashallach, which is a tiny little station here. So my ankle was causing me serious amounts of pains and I needed to have it looked at. The nearest place with minor injuries was in Inverness, so I spent a couple of hours on the train there. Chatted to a young geologist and Munro bagger while I was waiting for the train. Talked to a Canadian lanolin expert for the duration of the journey. At Inverness, I went over to the hospital and went to the minor injuries unit. I only waited for an hour or so before I was seen by the doctor. He noticed a patch of inflamed skin on my lower shin, picked up a cellulitis infection from a break in the skin, either a scratch that got bog water in or an insect bite. He gave me some antibiotics to treat it and told me to rest up and come back if it got worse. By this time it was about 8 p.m. on a Friday night in Inverness. All the hostels were sold out for the evening, so I had panicky thoughts about having to find a wood to pitch a tent in. What I did eventually find was a cheap hotel room in Dingwall, a town not too far away, so I got the bus there. The hotel was pretty basic, but it was somewhere to rest up and see if my leg was any better. I spent 3 nights there in total, leaving on the Monday. I was mostly lying in the room reading, my leg raised up, go out for a little lunchtime walk to the nearby supermarkets. Got an ankle brace and KT tape at Boots, which seemed to help. One night I went to this little Thai restaurant, which was pretty nice. When I first started feeling the kind of twinges of this injuries, I went into a kind of mini spiral. Definitely a downer, imagining the frustration of having to return home and then come back in the future to complete this. I spent so long planning and preparing for this. Luckily, after 3 days of rest and antibiotics, my leg felt much better, and I thought I'd give it a go, setting off again. I'd given myself plenty of time to complete the trail. I was also able to choose an easier alternate than the route I had initially planned. So on Monday morning, I left the hotel and got on the train to the Kearvig at Dingwall station. Really lovely train ride. Returned to Achnashallach station, this tiny little remote station in the woods. Set off up this gentle forestry track which rises above the valley and goes up to the Coolin Pass. Really beautiful view south out towards Strathcarron and the sea beyond. Coming over the Coolin Pass, I stopped for a bit of lunch, where I had some amazing views out towards the Ben Aig Massive. It was a really nice day as well, sunny but not too hot, and generally not too much to say about this section. Gentle forestry tracks and good views of the mountains beyond. A really nice alternate for if you're injured or if the weather is poor. Anyway, eventually you climb up through this forestry stuff here and then come back down into this forest. And in this bit of forest, what I did is I followed a track here right to the end. It's a kind of flattish spot for camping. Quite midgy once the wind had died down, especially when I gathered water from my little stream nearby. Had to put on the full midge net while I ate dinner. The day starts with a short pathless section that goes into Kinlochewe. Took almost an hour to walk, even though it's a couple of kilometres, because it's boggy and pathless. Kinlochewe is a nice little village. There's a general store and post office, which I went into to get a yoghurt and a banana. Then I went into the village car park where they've got some picnic benches. While I was sitting there, a couple in a camper van said hi and offered to make me a cup of tea. So I said yes and chatted to them about their travels while I had a cup of tea, telling me all about their journeys around the North Coast 500, and said bye to them and then set off again. The route follows a road up to the heights of Kinlochewe, where you turn off near some old buildings up this valley where the track is quite rough to begin with and the climb is also quite steep. Once you get to the top, it levels out and is much more manageable. Near the top of this valley, just before I got to these lochans, I stopped for lunch because there was a break in the clouds and a good amount of sun. This next couple of kilometres was one of my favourite bits on this kind of winding path with these views out over the lochs and the mountains. The path peters out and then you have to go on another pathless section. To begin with, you can kind of roughly see where people have been walking. There's little bits of path that you can make out as you come up to this little loch. The section beyond this to this Knockdamph is much trickier. There are loads of peat hags and I found it a lot trickier to kind of navigate, even though I could sort of see where I was going. Also around here I lost one of my zip-off trouser legs, which I'd put to dry on my pack. Once I reached this pass here, I got back onto a path, although it was quite a rough path and quite rocky, so you had to take it slowly descending down. Coming into the top of this valley, you get an amazing kind of vista out further north to the hills ahead, but also you get to see this kind of massive exposed slabs of rock and roaring water to your west as well, which is cool. The path improves kind of marginally, but it's not amazing by any means. By this point I was getting pretty tired and I was wanting to keep the length of the day down because of my ankle. This section here doesn't have that many great camp spots. I did manage to find a kind of flattish, dryish section of ground by the river. I decided to set up a camp for the night. Pretty nice spot by the river, down in this kind of steep valley, and there was a wind up as well, so there weren't really any midges. Once I cooked dinner, I got into my tent and it wasn't a moment too soon because the wind dropped after about 10 seconds. There were so many midges outside. I've never seen so many of them and I was so glad I was in my tent. Woke up to beautiful blue skies. My campsite was in the shadow of these hills, so there was no direct sun, but I could see the kind of peaks ahead. I had the morning sun on them, which was nice. The day starts with an easy descent down to this ford. The Cape Roth Trail, a kind of official route, heads west up to Bhudie and then sort of like loops back. But I wasn't staying at the Bhudie and was also taking alternates because of my legs. I took this track up here, which was a kind of steep climb up to the Dundonnell forest. It was an almost cloudless day, and as I came up to this apex of the track, I could see these like amazing silhouettes of all the mountains surrounding me. Over the top for a bit, and then you descend back down to Dundonnell itself. Went through some nice sort of meadowy areas, felt kind of, I don't know, like European alpine. The path comes out by this A road, which is not busy at all and has quite a large shoulder which you can walk along for hardly any time at all. You go past this house and loop back on yourself, and there's quite a steep climb up to this little valley here. It was really quite hot at this point and I was quite tired as well, so I found a nice section of rock sticking out from the heather and stopped for some lunch. Got some great views of the mountains. After lunch I continued heading up over on this path which goes over towards Ullapool. You go past these little lochans, amazing silhouettes of mountains in almost like every single direction you looked. The next part had a really horribly steep descent down towards Inverbrew. This section was so steep and was completely not what my leg needed, but I kind of managed to make it down. At the bottom it turned out that this was a coffin road, which was the way that they used to take the dead from remote communities to be buried. At Inverbroom I came to the O road which heads up to Ullapool and went down to a small lay-by to hitch a lift. I only had to wait about 5 minutes before someone stopped to pick me up. There was a lady who lived in Ullapool but was on her way back from her dentist appointment in Inverness. It seems there's a real dental desert in the Highlands. We chatted about the Cape Roth Trail, midges, Ullapool, etc. Before long she dropped me off in Ullapool right by the youth hostel. I'd stayed here a couple of years ago when I'd come back from Stornoway after cycling the Hebridean Way. It's a nice little youth hostel. I'd sent a resupply parcel to myself here, which I collected when I checked in. I just have to say that the staff were super helpful because I was originally going to be here over the weekend, but because of the time I spent dealing with my ankle injury, I wouldn't have been able to make my original booking. They were able to shift it forward for a couple of days for me. The whole of Ullapool suffered from a power cut this afternoon. The whole of Ullapool had suffered from a power cut that afternoon. So I was thinking that I'd have to wait maybe until tomorrow to have a shower. Luckily, about 10 minutes after I arrived, the power came back on, so I was able to have a shower and put my devices on charge. After sorting myself out, got some fish and chips in town, which were pretty good, and then went to the supermarket and I got some yoghurt and fruit for dessert. Back at the hostel, I paid to put a wash on. I have a nice little drying room with a washer and plenty of space for hanging things. Before I went to bed, I sat in the dining room and did some admin, like sorting out my resupply parcel and filling in my journal. Originally, I booked to spend 2 nights at this hostel to have a rest day in Ullapool. I'd already had quite a long rest day over the weekend in Dingwall, so I didn't really feel the need to have one here. Also, the weather for the next few days was forecast to be really good, so I packed up and went into Ullapool to get some last minute bits. I went to a hardware store and got some candles to take to Bothy's. Then I passed by a little cafe and got a coffee and a fried egg roll. And then I went back to Tesco to do a final resupply. Probably weighed an extra 5 kilos compared to the day before. So Ullapool isn't on the regular Cape Wrath Trail route, and the path that I took from was one of the alternates you can take. It is a really nice, gentle one though, compared to the official one. Mostly along tracks, perfect for a heavy pack and healing leg. So you go past a couple of quarries to begin with. You need to watch out for trucks and heavy vehicles. Soon after though, it becomes quite a nice, quiet road, which comes out and goes alongside Loch Nid. The weather here was absolutely stunning, completely blue skies. Passed by a little bit of forest for some shade and to keep things interesting. Further up this valley, I found a nice little spot to have lunch by a stream. As you head further up this valley, it starts to close in and climb a bit more. You pass by East Rudderrock Lodge. There's a farm with an absolutely great suspension bridge across the river. After this, the kind of track becomes way rougher, climbs up to this sort of mini pass here, where you can then see down to Loch Nid. The track descends, a bit kind of wiggly in places, and passes by Knockdamph Bothy. I arrived here pretty early, maybe 4 PM, but I couldn't really bother to go any further that day. So I went into the Bothy, put my stuff in, needed a bit of a sort out, so I swept it out and organised the various items people had left while I waited for it to be dinner time. It was nice having some candles to light as well once the sun had set. I have to say that it was quite a spooky stay for me because I was on my own. As the sun set, I got this kind of feeling, this like sense of unease, which made me feel a little bit spooked, but it was also quite late at this point and I didn't really want to go and set up a tent, so I just kind of stayed and hid in my sleeping bag. There was also a little rat or a mouse or something which I could hear scuffling around at night, which definitely didn't help with my sleep. Woke up to some very low cloud, almost kind of foggy. Setting off from the Bothy, the track winds its way down to the ford of the river coming from Loch Nid. Quite a wide crossing, but not deep at all. And then it's a short kind of climb over to the schoolhouse, which is another Bothy. By this point, there were kind of bursts of sunlight coming through the clouds. Stopped for a short break at the schoolhouse Bothy. Seemed like a nice little place. Met a young guy with an electric mountain bike who was using it to sort of zoom up through the wilds. Then the track you're on enters into the forest as you go up towards Oykel Bridge. Pretty relaxed walking, but not necessarily the most interesting. Somewhere around here I got signal and I rang the range control at Cape Wrath to check that the firing times for the kind of coming days were going to be alright, and they confirmed what the website said, saying there was no firing, so that was nice. Oykel Bridge, there's a little hotel. When I cycled the Hebridean Way a couple of years ago, I passed by here on the A837 on my return from Ullapool to Inverness. The hotel was open and serving little snacks. I got myself a coffee and a fried egg sandwich and sat inside. The Oykel River is a big salmon fishing river, and I sat and read some books about fishing while I had my coffee and egg roll. Shortly after I set off, the clouds started to clear, and once I'd left this wooded area, it was kind of bright sunshine for the rest of the day. I stopped somewhere around here and ate my lunch overlooking the river. Past this farm, continue on the tracks until you re-enter into a kind of forested bit. The route here starts to feel much wilder. There were also loads of these like really beautiful butterflies around. I think it must have been because it was such a hot day. As you head up the track, somewhere around here, the kind of track gives out and it just becomes a footpath along the side of the river, which was quite boggy. The official kind of map of the Cape Wrath Trail follows this track which goes kind of higher up on the valley. I would take this path which goes up by the side of the river because it was absolutely amazing. All of these trees and mountains rising above them. Felt like it could have been somewhere in the USA. Definitely one of my top sections of the trail. A little bit further up, you rejoin with the forestry track, and there's one of the few signs of the Cape Wrath Trail here by the river. The forestry track joins a road which goes round by the shore of Loch Nid to Benmore Lodge. Past Benmore House, the road becomes track again as you come up alongside the river Oykel again. There's a couple of places that you could pitch a tent as you head up on this little bit, but really the best place is actually around this ford here. And when I got there, there were a couple of people camped at the good spot by this track heading north, but I managed to find a small spot closer to this track heading east, which just about fit my tent. Made myself a bit of dinner and enjoyed a beautiful sunset with banks of clouds forming over the mountains. As expected, I woke up to low cloud and mist. Visibility was really low. At this point, the trail splits, either heading west over to Knockdamph or east around the back of us. In the west had more ascent, but the east is rougher and pathless. I chose the east one because I didn't want to do loads of climbing with my leg. This track heading east is pretty okay to begin with, but becomes way more indistinct to climb. By the time I passed by this little loch, got to these mini switchbacks, it had almost disappeared. It picks up again a little bit as you go through some of the kind of rockier, scree areas, but then reverts to being pretty indistinct and boggy on a fairly regular basis. At this ford, I met the guys who camped nearby me last night. They've been doing the Cape Wrath Trail in sections over the course of a couple of years, and this was their last section, setting off from Ullapool. And I wish I hadn't lost my trail journal because I can't remember what they were called, but they were really nice. More indistinct, rough, boggy paths for the next couple of kilometres, but once you meet up with this track here, you're on a 4x4 track, which is in way better condition. It kind of skirts the edges of the mountain a little bit up and down. Around here, the clouds started to lift a little bit, and I got some sort of views out over these kind of lochs here, which was cool. The track starts to kind of degrade and disappear as you head up towards this little loch to the west. Before you get to it, the path enters what I'd call these kind of boulder gardens, which are these areas of big rocks covered in moss and lichens, areas of short stunted trees as well. It feels like kind of being in a Japanese temple garden. Stopped here for lunch near the outflow of this lake and had a little rest. Managed to prop my camera up and use the self-timer successfully to do a little selfie. Following lunch, this next bit I think was the most challenging of the whole trail. It's pathless and it's really rough, and the low visibility also made navigating way trickier. So you start off crossing the river and then you descend down towards the lake, crossing peat hags and bogs, and then sort of semi-scrambling on this kind of steep slope above the lake. You head on the western bit of this loch. It gets a little bit easier from here, and I crossed over the inflow to this loch. Pretty rough and rocky as you head uphill. It gets a little bit easier on the high ground. There are quite a lot of peat bogs to navigate, which is always tricky. This last little bit was really tricky, really kind of boggy, lots of peat hags. When I finally saw the loch and reached this track, I almost jumped for joy. From when I set off after lunch, it took me about 3 hours to walk 5 kilometres. Having said that, the other people I'd talked to who'd taken other routes through this area said that they were also hard, so I think it's just a really kind of like tough area to walk in. The cloud was lower here and I could actually see down the valley, which was nice. And when I got to the top of Glencoul, I could see some blue sky in the distance, which was nice. As I got further down, it got sunnier. Out to the west, I could see clouds clinging to the edge of the mountains and then the sea beyond in the distance. This descent, though, was pretty steep and rocky, and I was glad to be at the end of it when I got to sea level. There's a little bridge across the river, and then you come to Glencoul. It's in a really beautiful location right by the sea. There's 2 rooms inside the bothy, and there's a grassy area outside for pitching tents, right on the beach, so it is quite rocky. There were a couple of sleeping mats inside when I arrived, so I set my tent up outside. While I was doing so, 2 guys from Morpeth who were here for the weekend to climb Munro came back. Had a good chat to them while we made dinner in the bothy. Both civil engineers and involved in running the mountain bothies in Northumberland. Names were Julian and Ben. They brought a little fire log and some coal, and we sat around the bothy fire having a bit of a chat. In the morning, Julie and Ben set off as I packed up. I followed them shortly afterwards. The path over to Glendu looks like it might be pretty easy, but it's quite rough in most places. Starts out as a track and climbs up pretty steeply. Beautiful views as you head over this spur in between the lochs. As you descend down towards Loch Glendu, the path goes through some rocky forest, and I think it's quite easy to lose the track here. Then it comes down to the Loch Shore. There's a kind of pathless section navigating through some of the boulders here. I think if the tide was low, this would be quite easy going, but I had to struggle around the huge boulders and slippy seaweed. Not long after this, you come to a little footbridge and a track that leads back round to Glen Bhudie. Beautiful sunny day, coming out of the shade of the mountain. Bhudie was bathed in sunlight, with Julian and Ben sitting outside making a cup of tea. I joined them for a short break and checked out the Bhudie, which seemed like it was quite a nice one. After having a quick snack, I then set off with them on the Lochside path. This is pretty easy, if a little bit up and down. Beautiful, loads of late summer flowers still about. Just quite nice to be walking in the sun and enjoying yourself. At Maol, I said goodbye to Ben and Julian. They were heading back to where they parked their car at Kinlochewe. This track climbs up inland and it's not too bad as uphills go. Somewhere near this loch I saw an adder sunning itself on the track. It's the first time I've ever seen one. At this little knoll here I stopped for some lunch to admire the views. It was a really, really nice day, with these kind of perfect blue skies and the silhouettes of mountains everywhere. After lunch, a little bit more climbing upwards till you reach another track and this shieling here. You can descend down to Achnashallach if you want a slightly easier route, or you can head west and go via Bhudie. I turned off and went up to Bhudie. The path here isn't a straightforward climb and it does quite a lot of wiggling around before it reaches the top, but oh boy, when you get to the top and it's a good day, you are rewarded by absolutely amazing panorama. Pretty much every direction from the top of this mountain, you get these amazing landscapes. The lines of the mountains to the north and the east. To the south, the sun glinting off the sea and the scattered islands there. To the west, just like thousands of little lakes. Really, really fantastic. After this, you descend on this quite tough, pathless section. You head down kind of west, taking care not to head too far north where it gets quite cliffy and too steep. I came down here, which is probably a bit of a mistake. I should have probably headed a little bit further west. I was also swarmed by flies here as I was descending, which wasn't really helpful. It is a little bit boggy in places as you go past these little lakes and rejoin up with the track, but once you're on this track it improves and becomes pretty decent. There's this beautiful little high valley with a loch that you go through, and as you round here you get a view north onto the rocky hills and Oykel, these big old mountains. Just steep descent to the A road, which is a Highland A road and was pretty much empty. The path goes past Lochstack Lodge up through these rocky outcroppings to the kind of foot of Oykel. The sun had set by this point, so I was really on the lookout for places to camp. Didn't find anywhere good until just after this footbridge, where there was a kind of flattish, drier spot just off from the track. Set my tent up pretty quickly and made dinner in the fading light. Woke up to an overcast grey day with little wind. Followed this track north and then turned off for another pathless section, which was generally okay and quite easy until you got to the loch. The path by the loch was another story. It was rough and boggy and kind of falling apart and completely midge infested. I had to put the head net on and it seemed to take ages to get to the end of it. But reaching the end of the loch, the walking became easier. There's a little river crossing and you come to a boathouse and get onto a semi-decent path which heads down to Reconic, where there's a hotel which wasn't open and there's also a public toilet by the road. And then it's a long old road walk to Kinlochewe. This road is busier than you might think it is because Kinlochewe is a fishing port, so there's quite a lot of traffic. Pretty windy and up and down, but nice views out to these sea lochs. I passed by Glencoul, where you can find the London Stores, which is described as a Cape Wrath institution. This is another tiny shop crammed full of loads of stuff, and it had a surprisingly good selection of fresh food. I picked up some snacks and some other bits here. I also purchased a big band of kindling. Planned to stay at Bhudie later that evening and wanted wood for a fire. There was no way I could carry a bag of logs, but I could probably manage some kindling. Then I decided to take the route to Sandwood Bay from Blairmore, since apparently you could sometimes see the lighthouse on your way down to the bay. I strapped all this kindling to my backpack and after about 10 steps I almost immediately regretted buying it. It made my pack super heavy, perhaps even heavier than when I started. Anyway, there was a kind of long road walk through Kinlochewe, past Kinlochewe, till I came to Blairmore, where you turn off onto a track and head towards the Cape. Pretty gentle and winding path, goes past some little lochans. I met a guy who was training for a Land's End to John O'Groats walk, somewhere around here. Further on towards the bay, there were a group of guys on the path. There was a German guy, 2 guys from Slovakia and an Irish guy. Said hello, but then passed by them and came down to Stanwood Bay, which is definitely a special place. It's kind of wide open to the ocean with these sand dunes. Pretty moody weather, but still beautiful. Been reading about it for so long, and it was great to finally be there. I think it would have been a good place to camp if the weather is good. The forecast was for pretty heavy rain later, so I didn't linger and I pressed on. The good news is I could just make out the Cape through the low cloud. I walked down to the beach and crossed the outlet of Sandwood Loch, and then had a rough and boggy few kilometres to Strathchailleach boggy. It took way longer than I expected, and it started raining pretty heavily. Finally, crossing this fence, I came to Bothy, which is a tiny low hut. I was really glad that there was a bothy there. I was the only person there when I arrived, so I took off my wet things and settled in, sorted out my stuff, and made a bit of dinner. Started to get a fire going too. Just as this fire started to get going, the group of guys from earlier stumbled in. They were pretty happy to come into a fire in a little bit of warmth. There was a German guy called Toby who'd been walking the Cape Roth Trail in sections over a couple of years. 2 guys from Slovakia, Tibor and Martin, who were walking the entire Cape Roth Trail, and Fred, an Irish guy who lived in Kinlochewe. Things were put by the fire to dry, dinner was made, and a bottle of vodka was passed around. They'd all been down the pub in Kinlochewe, so it was a bit of a rowdy evening by the fire as we worked our way through the bag of kindling which I bought. Definitely worth the extra weight. Had a bunch of extra food for my resupply parcels, so I made myself a second dinner too. Went to bed to the sounds of a storm outside. Up to the sound of a storm outside. When I went outside to go to the toilet, I could see that the river by the Bothy had turned into a roaring torrent and was fully in spate. What would have been an easy crossing was now completely impassable. It would have been really frustrating to have to turn back now. I was so close after all that I'd been through. So I had a look at the map with the others, and we thought that we'd head upriver to see if we could find somewhere to cross. Got ourselves ready and headed out into the rain and the wind. For a good while as we headed up the river, it was a complete roaring torrent. As we crossed more and more of these little tributary streams, it started to chill out a little bit. We tested a couple of places with poles, but the water was above waist deep. Eventually we came to a place which we thought we'd try to attempt to cross. The water was a bit gentler and there was a rock midstream to provide some shelter from the flow of the water. I hiked up my trousers, I got my poles out and started walking across. Water was coming up to about my mid-thighs and it was pretty strong. I slowly crab walked across facing the current. The rock in the middle was good, but the other side had a surprisingly deep section, so I had to sort of like walk upstream to find somewhere slightly shallower and then get close enough to grab the other side and pull myself up to the bank. Martin and Tibor came across net and I helped them up the bank as they came to my side. Toby decided that he didn't want to cross, and to be honest I see how he felt because it was a little bit sketchy. Everyone has their own comfort level in terms of risk and you've got to respect that. We asked if he wanted to walk further upriver to find a shallower place to cross, but he was going to go back to Kinlochewe, so we said goodbye and set off. So from Strathchailleach to the Cape is pretty much completely pathless, but that being said, as the pathless sections go, it's not terrible. Had some squally rain showers come and go, but by the time we were heading towards the range boundary, it all started to die out. There was another river crossing here, which was swollen with the rain, but way easier than the previous one. And there were no flags or red lights on the range, so we crossed over the barbed wire fence and entered into the range somewhere around here. Along the edge of this hill and up over this kind of mini saddle, but coming over, the sun was out now, although the wind was strong. We couldn't see the lighthouse, but we could see all the kind of radio masts from it picking up, kind of tempting us. Heading down here, you can see there's a path which with the Cape Roth Trail. People are sort of worn in, a little bit boggy in places, and one final river crossing by these old shielings. And then there's a short climb up to a track. Seriously glad to be back on a proper path. The track winds round Durness Moor, and suddenly we could see the Cape Roth Lighthouse, the end of the trail. We walked into the lighthouse grounds and we'd done it. We completed the Cape Wrath Trail. There's a little cafe here, a family who live in the lighthouse run. Tibor and Martin went inside while I dropped my pack, while I walked up to the lighthouse and the edge of the cape itself. Then I went inside and joined them at the cafe. Got some coffee and beans on toast, as well as some little snacks. Sat in the cafe for a while, chatting to Tibor and Martin, figuring out what to do next. There's a bunkhouse that you can stay in at the lighthouse, but there's also a bothy not too far away. The lady at the cafe said that there was a ferry arranged for tomorrow morning, so I decided to have one last bothy stay and do a little bit more walking to decompress from the trail. Tibor and Martin decided to stay at the lighthouse, so I said goodbye to them and set off. Such nice weather, and the route to Kearvig is a kind of nice, winding, pretty gentle track. Kearvig itself is a really beautiful bothy located right by the ocean. It's massive too, with 2 entrances and 2 kind of separate spaces. One is just a single room, and one has kind of multiple rooms and even an upstairs bit. I put all my stuff in the single room part of the bothy and then got my stuff ready for the night. Later on, a guy came by in an ATV. He was a stalker and was spotting for his partner who was stalking deer on a nearby hillside. Had a bit of a chat to him and then went back inside when he set off for the evening. Made dinner and lit a small fire with some wood that was in the bothy. Pretty cosy evening. I went outside to pee before going to bed though, and I heard all these kind of strange moans, which I soon realised were herds of deer that had come down from the moor. Pretty spooky to see all the gleaming reflections of their eyes in your head torch and their grunts in the darkness. Woke up feeling a little bit of a rush because the ferry was due at 10:30 and it was about a 12-kilometre walk to the landing point. As I was walking along, I saw these massive birds in the distance. I think there may have been sea eagles of some kind. And coming around to the Carl of Durness, I could see seals sunning themselves on the bits of exposed sand. I made it to the landing at just about 10:30 and no one was there, so I rang the ferryman. It turns out that he wasn't due to come for another 45 minutes, so I could have had a way more relaxed morning. If you do this, ring the ferryman as soon as you get a signal. A little bit later, John from the lighthouse turned up with Tibor, Martin, a Dutch guy called Bart, who'd just finished the Scottish National Trail, and came over carrying a father and son on their bikes. The ferry is a pretty short ride over and costs £10. You do need to arrange it in advance by ringing the ferryman, a guy called Shifty. There is an alternative which involves walking on a kind of pathless section around the Kyle and then takes you out by this A road here, but it's something you probably want to avoid doing. On the other side of the Kyle, John from the lighthouse gave us a lift into Durness, which has a bunch of facilities in, a really well stocked shop, which we went crazy in, a campsite, a bunkhouse and a pub. I wanted to try hitchhiking to Wick, where I'd be able to get a train down to Inverness. What actually happened was that I stood outside the shop for about 3 hours in the wind and got extremely cold and then gave up. There's a bus that goes from Durness to Inverness that you can take in the morning. You need to book on it in advance though, as it fills up, and it's also the school bus. So in the end, I stayed in the campsite with Martin, Bart and Tibor. The next morning we got a bus back to Inverness, went through Kinlochewe and a few of the places the trail had passed through. At Kinlochewe, Turby, the German walker, got on the bus. Kind of felt like a bit of a strange reunion. It was quite a nice way to end the trail. At the bus station in Inverness, I said goodbye to everyone, and shortly after got on a train to Edinburgh to continue my journey home. And that is the end of my Cape Wrath Trail experience. My time on the Cape Wrath Trail felt like a real adventure, challenging and rewarding in equal measure. I felt a real sense of accomplishment in having successfully walked it, especially when I think back to the point where I had to go off trail because of my leg, and I thought that I might have to head home. I think this success is kind of a mixture of good preparation, a bit of luck, and being quite stubborn. Definitely an experience that will stay with me. There's a personal association to this trail for me as well. Back in the mid-1990s, my great aunt walked from Beachy Head to Cape Wrath over the course of 2 years. She did this when she was in her 70s and wrote a book about it. Really quite a remarkable woman. She died when I was a young child, so I only have a vague memory of her. Reading the parts of her book where our paths coincided, I could recognise her descriptions of the places we had both walked through. Felt quite a strong connection to this woman and her journey, despite the 30 years that separated us. Let's look at some trail stats. I walked a total of 386 kilometres with 980 metres of elevation gain. It took me 19 calendar days to complete the trail, with 17 walking days and 2 rest days. My longest distance day was the second day at 32 kilometres, going from Glen Cona to Glen Dessary. The shortest day was day 7 at 5 kilometres, where I left the trail to sort my leg out. Elevation wise, day 4 had the greatest amount of climb at 1290 metres, going over from Barisdale to Shiel Bridge. The first half of the trail definitely has the majority of the bigger climbing days. I camped in the wild for 6 nights. 6 nights staying in or by a bothy, and camped at campsites 3 nights, 1 hostel stay, and 3 nights in a hotel. I took 2 ferries and hitchhiked twice. I went over 10 mountain passes and waded across rivers 17 times. So that's the Cape Wrath Trail. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more hiking adventures.